In this part, we'll be getting the players to move around. We'll start with usermain.h, the usermain header file. Add a private boolean is pressed, which we'll use to determine whether the player is clicking or touching, or in other words, pressing. Another private boolean is dragging will help us determine if a player object is currently being dragged around. And finally, a private pointer dragged player, which will hold the currently dragged player object. You'll see why we need these soon. Now before we do anything, we want to initialize our new variables. In usermain start function, set is pressed to false and also is dragged to false. The game starts with the user not pressing and no player being dragged. Next, we'll set up is pressed to reflect whether the player is indeed pressing down. In pointer pressed, is pressed must equal true, while in pointer release, is pressed must equal false. Now let's add the logic to move the players. Go to usermain's update function, which fires once a frame, meaning the code will constantly execute. The first line creates a new pointer, player. The getCursorPoint function returns the coordinates of the cursor. Using this coordinate, we use the getObjectAtPoint function to return whichever object is under the cursor. Usermain's get function penultimately returns the object at that point. And finally, we typecast the result as an object pointer. Player now contains whatever object is at the cursor's point. We still don't know if that object is a player, however. The conditional below tests two things. Firstly, that player does indeed contain an object, or in other words, the cursor is above an object. And secondly, the user is not already dragging a player. We don't want to drag two players at once. If both of these cases prove to be true, we next need to determine if our player is indeed a player object. We compare the object's tag to player, and if this is true, then the object is a player and we can continue. If not, the cursor is above a different object, for example, an enemy. We set is dragging to true since we are now dragging a player. Dragged player becomes the object below the cursor, typecast to a player pointer. Now that we have found a player to drag, let's drag it. If the player is still pressing down and dragged player contains a previously discovered player object, then we can set that player's position to the cursor's point every update, thus dragging it. As a simple added touch, we also scale it up slightly, so as to make the player appear to pop up lifted from the battlefield. However, if the player is no longer pressing the screen, we don't want to move any objects. Therefore, is dragging becomes false, and if dragged player still contains an object, we want to return its scale to normal, appearing to replace the player. We also empty dragged player, so it no longer points to a player object. If you run this now, you'll notice one last thing. The player drops out of the sky and completely off the screen. In player.cpp, in the onStart function, we simply want to set the gravity to 0. This will stop it from falling. The player can still leave the screen though. In player.cpp's onUpdate function, we want to test its position. If it is outside a certain boundary, we simply set its position back inside the boundary. From top to bottom we test the right side, the left side, the top side, and the bottom side. And there we have it, our players can move. For now, ignore the text "This is XAML" on the screen. We'll be covering that later. The next part will be covering arming the player.